Okay. All right, it's after 5 o'clock, so I will call the special board meeting of the Comfort Lake Forest Lake Watershed District to order. We have 3 items of business on this evening's agenda. We have the 2020 audit, discussion and action. We have the Comfort Lake Forest Lake diagnostic study and presentation, and we have a discussion about the Lake Association cost share program. So I will turn it over to Emily and get us started on the audit, I guess.
Sure, I can just start the video and I'll keep an eye out and see if people join.
Okay.
The auditor is not going to be able to join us for this meeting, but they did pre-record a presentation. It's about 8 minutes long, and I'll just go ahead and play that.
Okay.
Welcome to the Comfort Lake Forest Lake Watershed District 2020 Financial Statement Audit Presentation. My name is Justin Nelson. I'm an audit manager with Abdo Eichenmeyers, and I've been doing the Comfort Lake Forest Lake Watershed District audit for a number of years. I'd first like to just say thank you to the staff for all their help in preparing things for the current audit. We couldn't have done it without you, and we appreciate all your help as we did things a little bit differently this year with a remote audit process. So I'd also like to just say thank you to the board for having us as your audit firm. We appreciate it, and we look forward to your partnership in many more years to come. So to start, we'll go over the audit results for 2020. So we are hired to give an opinion on the audited financial statements and internal controls that surround those financial statements. For the 2020 audit year, we are issuing a clean, unmodified audit opinion, which is the opinion that the Watershed District is shooting for. So how we arrived at our opinion is we tested all of our same transactions remotely this year, surrounding paying bills, paying of employees, looking at tax transactions, tax revenue transactions, looking at grants, what the board is getting to make decisions, etc. So with that, we do have a couple findings that I'll go over on the next slide. So the second thing we are required to do as part of our audit is look at Minnesota statutes and legal compliance. The Office of the State Auditor does put guides on their website that we are required to test as part of our audit. So 2 examples of those would be timely paying of claims and conflicts of interest with anybody at the Watershed District or anybody on the board. So we don't have any findings related to Minnesota legal compliance for 2020. So the audit results, again, I did mention that there are 2 findings. So the first of the 2 findings is processing of payroll. So this is somewhat of a carryover finding from the prior year. We did report this same finding, noting that there was some issues processing of payroll, paying of PERA, and other benefit payments. So because some of these issues and some of these payments did carry into the 2020 audit year, we do kind of feel that it's necessary to again report this finding again in 2020. One of the main reasons we did decide to continue reporting is the GASB 68 PERA pension liability schedules do show differing numbers from what was actually contributed to PERA in both audit years. So that is a big reason we're reporting it. So I think the last thing to point out too, and a question from staff too, is just to note that I think all employees, para, and all their benefits are correct in the financial software. However, just with how things cleaned up with PERA and just noting that some of these issues did carry into 2020, we did decide to continue reporting in 2020. Second finding for 2020 relates to escrow liability and permitting. So this is an internal control finding, related to the whole process of escrows and permitting. So it was noted when we started the audit that there was no permitting revenue. And this has been something that we've discussed in the past, and just getting a detailed listing that matches the financial software related to outstanding escrow liability. So, upon further discussions, the staff did reach out to the accountants and had some discussions and some work done to reconcile everything to make sure that all permits are up to date and match the accounting software. So I think that the finding really relates to putting procedures and controls in place, and I think that the procedures and controls really do relate to reconciling things monthly, and I think the staff is committed to that, and we hope that this isn't an issue in future years. So switching gears a little bit and going into the general fund balance compared to future year's budget. So as we look at this chart, again, like I said, we do compare the general fund balance to the budget of the future year, noting what a good reserve level percentage would be. So, over the past 4 years, the trend is in the downward direction. So, I think part of that relates to the raising of the general fund budget, but it also relates to just some spending over appropriations as well. So I think overall the thing to note here is that there is a negative trend. It doesn't necessarily have to be bad, but 7% is a little bit on the lower side. And to review that percentage and what a good minimum would be for the general fund for future years to come. So how we arrived at that in 2020, again, we did have, what we do show here is a final budget compared to the actual amounts with the variance on the right-hand side. So it is important to note that the watershed did budget for a decrease in fund balance of about $90,000 in 2020. So, actual results came in much more favorable, where the net change in fund balance was about $33,000 there to get to an ending fund balance of about $27,000. So I think overall the revenue is pretty comparable to budget, no significant outliers. One of the positive budget variances in the expenditures that did, kind of help it not decrease compared to budget would be the expenditure variance related to office expenditures and manager per diems. So those kind of do make up a majority of the difference there for a positive budget variance in the expenditures. Next one is just looking at the project and program and project implementation fund budget to actual statement. Again, a lot of detail here that's kind of condensed into one little chart, but as we can see, again, the program and project implementation fund did budget for about an increase of $90,000. Actual results were a little bit of a decrease of about $7,000 there. So how we got there, just looking at the revenues did have a negative budget variance. A big reason for that is just, grant revenues that are only recognized when expenditures occur and the grant is earned. So a big piece of that related to some of the grants and things that were under budget just because of when those grants are spent and when their revenue is recognized. So expenditures also contribute to that, which were under budget by about $600,000. So we did note that the biggest budget variance in the expenditures related to individual lake projects under about $330,000 there. So, the only other thing to point out with the project program and project fund is just to note that there is a loan outstanding there. So the budget to actual related to those loan proceeds does throw things a little bit differently, but overall it does contribute to about a $7,000 decrease in fund balance. I think the last thing to point out too is just that the overall loan proceeds can only be recognized when they are drawn upon. So there's no receivables or anything related to loans. There is probably a larger loan draw that is outstanding towards the beginning of 2021 that may, if it were to be done in December, may have changed the results a little bit differently. So that reaches the end of my presentation. I appreciate you giving me some time to go over the findings of our audit. You can see our contact information. I really appreciate the time, and I really encourage you to reach out to me with any questions. I know I did the presentation via video, so if there's any questions, I'm certainly available to attend a future meeting, and just really wish you good luck in the upcoming year. And again, thank you for the opportunity to present.
All right. All right. So, Mike or Steve, any comments or additional points on the audit?
I think the only thing is that we need to look at what our general fund to the budget should be ratio. 7% is pretty low.
Okay.
And maybe we can do that offline. I'm not sure we have to do it tonight, but
Okay. Mike, did you have something regarding the budget or the audit? I mean, not the budget, the audit.
No, just that. So I talked to Justin just before the meeting here, well, an hour ago or so, and he had told me that They don't have the final report, but he did communicate that there will be no adjustments to the numbers. So it'll just be, so even though they don't have the final one there for the board, so whether we want to make it conditional upon review of the treasurer or something as well, we could do that. Otherwise, the motion would remain.
So we would be accepting the report conditional, on the final, reviewing the final report with the treasurer.
I think so. We could add counsel on there too if we wanted, but
Okay.
no.
Okay, any other questions for Mike or Steve regarding the audit?
When, Mike, when will we have a chance to review that? Is that, it has to be in by a certain date, doesn't it?
The audit doesn't need to be in until the end of June.
Okay.
So we just wanted the final audited numbers for our annual report to go to Bowser.
Okay,
Which is
got it.
due the end of the week. But so there was this sequencing that occurred. We didn't have everything on the escrow piece back to them until Monday. And then when they had that, then they had to send a letter to legal, and legal then had to turn it around. So they're expecting that this afternoon or first thing in the morning, and then they can finalize the audit report. So,
Okay, so technically then we have what we believe are the correct final numbers to put into our report.
yes, the only thing we're waiting on is the letter from council, but you know, that's only it's not Smith Partners' fault. It's our fault in delaying getting the numbers to the auditor.
Gotcha, okay. So we don't necessarily need to accept the report this evening, but we need to accept that we can use the audit numbers that were reported to us for our annual report, right?
I think you can conditionally accept the audit report
Okay,
based on the presentation and the materials provided. You know, upon review by the treasurer and council.
okay.
And then direct staff to, I guess, well, the board accepts this one, of course, because it's being presented. They're doing it as an outside entity for the board.
Right.
We'll just use the numbers then for our other reports.
Okay. All right, any other questions then for Mike or Steve who participated in the audit? All right, then I think the motion to conditionally accept the audit is in order.
I'll move that we conditionally accept the audit based upon the review by treasurer and legal counsel.
I'll second.
All right, motion's been made and seconded. I will call the roll. Manager Anderson,
Aye.
Manager Schmaltz,
Aye.
Manager Oknick,
Aye.
Manager Spence, aye. All right. Let's move on to the Little Comfort Lake Diagnostic Study and Presentation.
Right, Mr. President, managers, I believe I'm going to share my screen.
Right.
And I think it's going to present on my second screen. So that's what I'm going to share it first, and then let me know if this works when I go into presentation mode. Do you
Yep.
see just
Yeah.
a slide, nothing else? Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Looks good.
All right. Well, thank you for your patience at long last. What I put together, this was a big study. So I do have a few slides that touch on pretty much every section within the larger report, just highlighting our approach, what we thought was interesting, areas we dug in that were maybe different than other lakes. So that's what I'll present today. Feel free to jump in with questions as we go. Yeah. So just to start off again with a little bit of background, and this is mentioned briefly in the start of the report, but this is in the larger context of the district's adaptive management approach. The 5 arrows on top was something we first put in the Forest Lake Diagnostics study. We've used it in the watershed management plan, just to kind of help others walk through the steps that this district takes compared to others. So, there's the tributary monitoring that's much more extensive than other areas. Then we use that to follow up with modeling and diagnostic reports. That's kind of our high level, looking at everything, the big picture. That is what this study is. And then, drilling down into more detail, what we see as the areas of concern, then are followed up with more specific feasibility studies and assessments. And then we get into design once we get to, an actual specific project, and then effectiveness monitoring. So most of the monitoring data displayed in this report is from 2016 to 2019. And recall as well that many of the long-term ISCO sites are in the Comfort Lake Management District and the inlet to Little Comfort Lake. So that also played heavily into the data that we used. And then I did want to kind of walk through the areas. It ends up being a large area to cover. Comfort Lake being the downstream lake in the whole watershed district is a little bit of a unique case in that it's impacted by pretty much the entire district. So our focus area was the Comfort and Little Comfort Lake Management Districts. Comfort and Little Comfort are very closely connected. We'd looked at Bone Lake Management District previously, the Forest Lake Management District. And so you can see actually when you combine the Little Comfort, Comfort Lake Management Districts, it's about the same area actually as the Bone and Forest separately, a little bit more, a couple thousand acres more. But so it just seemed to make sense, as in past studies, to put the two primary drainage areas to those lakes in the study. All right, this slide is super text heavy, a mouthful, but it helps me too to kind of just start to lay out in my mind. And this district is very prolific with work and studies. So I just wanted to outline and just get in one spot as of this study, what had been done, kind of everything that we were drawing upon. And some of this work was being conducted in parallel. That was one of the interesting parts of this, putting this study together compared to other ones, is we kind of been plowing ahead in several other lines of work that feed into it and will continue past this study. So, in terms of monitoring, like I said, recall we do have long-term monitoring at many sites in the Comfort Lake Management District that date back to 2004. Other areas really just had the outlet. So that was a nice data set to have that we didn't have in previous studies. And then we dug in a little more detail in that Little Comfort area in 2016 to 2018 that supplemented the long-term ISCO sites. And of course, we have all of that summarized as well in the water monitoring report. And then just to walk through, I was looking back, as you'll see in that first chapter, the 2002 Comfort Lake Diagnostic Study, the 2007 Capital Improvement Plan, we had the Six Lakes TMDL, the Comfort Lake Paleo Study, and then the H&H Model Update in Comfort Lake Management District. In terms of project feasibility, of course, we have our Sunrise Engineers report that really hit on a lot of the key projects that still remain a priority based on even the updated findings. And then also, since we're covering both lake management districts, the Bone Lake Outlet wetland feasibility is within that realm of the adaptive management phases. And then the Heath Avenue, the regional treatment and downtown study, Greenway Corridor Vision, these all have aspects of project feasibility. In terms of completed design and implementation, we have the Greening the Big Box, that Target project, and then the Bixby Park Water Quality Improvement Project from 2012 and 2014, respectively, for Clean Water Fund grants. And then we also have some existing effectiveness monitoring data of the Broadway Basin in 2013 and 2014, and then Bixby Park. So that's nice sometimes to just summarize what we have to start from. The other thing, and I had seen this in the 2002 study that I felt was important to carry forward, there was a very detailed history. Manager Anderson is one of the authors of that. So I put that in this new study and then noted the additions in gray. So we went back and added a few rows within the longer history to look more at AIS. I worked with Garrett on that, and we reached out to DNR, in fact, on some of those. And then just whatever's happened since that study was completed. So I think this is one area, since it does cover a lot of area in the district, if there's any additions or corrections that any of the managers have noted as you read through it. I mean, that's one area in particular that we knew there might not be, or we knew you might have some additions. So you could follow up with district staff to Emily or to me directly, and we can make those updates. All right, then we get into just the diagnostic investigation. So, in terms of just lake characteristics, can just do a quick side by side. They're all in the report, but sometimes harder to see in that format. So Comfort Lake is 218 acres, Little Comfort 37. Their maximum depths are pretty similar, as are their average depths. And then, of course, Comfort Lake has 3.2 miles of shoreline. Little Comfort has just 1. The images I'm showing have all the inputs. We'll talk about those later, but I pulled that from the report, but just talking about the key tributaries and groundwater and the flow pathways. And then, of course, in terms of hydrology, one of the things that we paid close attention to and had some extra data collected in 2020 was to better understand that connection under Highway 8. So we did take lake level measurements. We took some water quality. With COVID and it being a little more difficult, we didn't have a lot of samples, and I would say it was a little inconclusive for the ones that we did have. One of the things moving forward that we've modified our plan is just realizing the importance of having those lake levels collected on the same exact day. We were noticing some differences if they're a few days off, and just wanted to make sure it's not due to winds causing, a harder reading on one lake. There might be waves, or even that you can get a seiche to form, a fetch where it just pushes down on the lake level. That would be particularly a possibility in Comfort, which has a long pathway. And then, there are other more sophisticated ways to really get at the hydrology. Now, I'll go into more detail when I talk about the modeling, but it was clear when I started to update the lake models that there's something going on with the water budget. In Comfort Lake, the inlet at West Comfort Drive is very close to the outlet. So there seemed to be some evidence to support that under large rain events that might short circuit. And then, it's really not clear. The lakes are connected. Is it always Little Comfort to Comfort Lake? So, flow tracing can be done with stable isotopes. I did reach out to Mark Edlin since we finished the report. The drainage area might be a little too small to get enough difference to have that show any differentiation. There are bidirectional flow monitors. I think Rice Creek Watershed might actually be looking into that for Centerville Peltier Lakes. That's a similar area where they suspect backflow. And so we're considering using that technology. And so I think it will be useful to see what they find, to see if they thought it was even worth it. I know those float sensors can get clogged up. So, it's not always a given that it'll help with that. So, but moving forward, we haven't had lake levels on Little Comfort. So with district staff now leading up the lake monitoring program, I think that'll get a lot of good data for the district to better understand that connection. And I think that will say a lot, just having a longer term record between those two. So then we have our typical, and this is in our water monitoring report, so I'll just kind of gloss over it, but the key thing, Comfort Lake's growing season average phosphorus is about 31, 32, depending if you're looking at a 10-year or 5-year average. That's pretty close to its long-term goal of 30, but more work needs to be done, of course. Chlorophyll is up around 15, which is a little higher than you'd expect from your phosphorus concentration. The Secchi has been significantly improving since 2011, and the phosphorus has been at or below the state standard since 2007. Little Comfort, we're right about 50 parts per billion for phosphorus. Chlorophyll is 20, 24. And the phosphorus has been fluctuating around that state standard. There's some years that are lower, but it fluctuates well above in many years. And I would say the phosphorus was below the TP standard in 2020, but that was the first time since 2011. And that just shows that year-to-year variability that we see in lakes and why we look at these longer-term averages. Okay, so something that we dug in a little more detail was on nitrogen. That had been an interest of the board and something we've been wondering about since we are seeing higher chlorophyll than we'd expect from phosphorus. So we do have a nice database of nitrogen that's been part of the lake monitoring program. So we have this, it's called, sometimes it's listed as TKN. You'll see it's just a type of total nitrogen assessment. But if we just consider it nitrogen, based on EPA ranges for lakes, it's within the eutrophic range for both lakes. And that makes sense with the algae blooms that we do see in both lakes. But one of the key factors we are interested in is that nitrogen to phosphorus ratio. So we focus on phosphorus because almost always in Minnesota, it's the limiting nutrient, meaning if you add more phosphorus, you get more algae. They have enough nitrogen. You know, we see that nitrogen is in that eutrophic range, but that just means that there's plenty of nitrogen. But adding more nitrogen doesn't necessarily mean that that's what will increase chlorophyll or algae, and decreasing nitrogen doesn't necessarily mean it'll decrease algae if it's not the limiting nutrient. So the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, if you look at the levels together, because that's what the algae would care about, if it's over 17 parts nitrogen to 1 part phosphorus, essentially phosphorus is what's limiting. So you don't have enough phosphorus. And for both lakes, the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio is well above that. So that's one piece of evidence we can use to help us understand if nitrogen is important. But then I did want to just share, you know, we use a phosphorus to chlorophyll relationship that was based on what the state used to develop their state water quality standards. And it's based on a huge data set, but basically they drew a straight line in that, you know, cloud of data and said, okay, this is how we're going to determine our standards. So for 40 parts per billion phosphorus, we would expect 14 micrograms of chlorophyll. And all I wanted to illustrate with this figure is, you know, like you would expect, our lakes fall along that line and on either side of it. And then I did circle where Comfort Lake falls. And so you can see in a handful of years, there's more algae than you'd expect from that phosphorus concentration. So we would expect that with the district lakes, but you can see that a lot of the points do fall slightly above. So if anything, that might just say our phosphorus goals, one, are good ones. I'm glad it's below the state standard. And then once we reach those, it's really a matter of making sure that we have, you know, extra measures of safety. And we're also looking at the other factors that impact algae growth, like fish and general clarity of the water.
Can we
And then,
interrupt?
yep, certainly.
go
This is
along?
where we
Okay.
kind of get into new information.
Yeah, this is a little confusing. I'm not quite sure I understood what you said. It sounded like we were chasing our tails there, but for a minute, but I'm sure you can clarify it. If our phosphorus is below the state average, so we're doing better than the state standard for lakes in our eco region, then why are we having algae blooms? Why are we having tremendous amounts of dangerous, you know, potential dangerous phosphorus, or excuse me, algae outbreaks? The
So
blue-green style. So what's causing that? Is it the sediment buildup on the bottom? Is it low oxygen? You know, what is it exactly?
So and I've been thinking about this, right? Because these are the questions that keep coming up. And it's Comfort Lake, and it's the Forest Lake Middle Basin. So other things that play a role are climate. So this reference data set was determined well over 20 years ago. Well, maybe about 20 years ago now. And so for even a given amount of phosphorus in a lake, it also depends, algae, so that's the nutrient aspect. So algae need a nutrient, but like plants indoor, they also need warm temperatures. So I think some of the variability from year to year is our lakes, the ice goes off a little sooner and they can stratify and heat up and have warmer surface water. So under those conditions, if we had a warmer summer, for the same amount of phosphorus, we would see more algae. So then that gets at some of these climatic variables. Now we can't always do something about that. And so the solution would be then to have less nutrients than even if the conditions are such that algae, it's just great conditions because it's nice and warm, they get lots of sunlight. So they need even less phosphorus to grow. Because
Well, is it a factor of sunlight getting down into the water as well?
That's one aspect, but the algae really, and if you can even look in the dissolved oxygen profiles, so you'll see actually a spike of oxygen as you go down into the water, and it's all within the first couple meters of the surface. So they have plenty of sunlight. So our Secchi depths would show that, you know, within that top water where it's nice and warm and they get their nutrients, that's it wouldn't be light limited. The only time I've really seen that, and this is looking at lakes statewide and streams, is some really turbid streams in the Red River Valley or in these basins that have a lot of clay. That's where that relationship can get really skewed. And then also lakes that are really stained in northern Minnesota. So there's less algae actually for the phosphorus than you'd expect because basically they're shaded out. So, and I think the point is we're pretty close, but you're right. And it's the number of algae blooms we have, so it's the frequency and the severity. And when we're looking at our data, it's a summer average. So one of the other factors that you can look at is just that maximum chlorophyll, and that might be something for the lakes. And I can actually we have all the lake data in a nice database. So this is how these figures were created pretty quickly. You can look at your maximum chlorophyll in any given year compared to your average concentrations.
But they're not where they're supposed to be, though. I mean, I heard that they're kind of out of sync with what you would expect.
From the average, and I guess I don't want to say where I think they should be, but our lakes are clumping a little bit above that. And that's where on the figure I'm showing, that diagonal dashed line, that would essentially be, you know, middle of the road for all the reference lakes in the state. And so since the points for our lakes, and they're color coded by year and a symbol. So there's a lot of information on that, but just look at the points, and most of them are above the line. So that means we get more algae than expected from the phosphorus.
And nitrogen, you said, was in range. So that wouldn't be a cause?
Right. And basically we were trying to just dig into that nitrogen factor here. Based on what we're seeing, the only lake, and these are two little sides. This isn't in the report, but if we look at all our lakes, this figure has a lot on it, but there's the gray area, and that's showing, this is the top of that gray bar is that 17:1 nitrogen to phosphorus ratio. And then you can see just on along the bottom on the x-axis is just our general phosphorus concentration. So kind of can see where the lakes fall in terms of how nutrient rich they are. And really the only lake that's getting close to that nitrogen limitation line is Moody. And we see that also in another way to look at the data. So here along the x-axis is just our summer average nitrogen levels in all the lakes. And then on the x-axis up and down, we have the amount of chlorophyll. So, you know, most of the lakes kind of scatter together. They have about the same amount of nitrogen, but Moody is a little bit of an outlier of having more nitrogen than the rest of the lakes. And so that may be one of the lakes, if we just dug into nitrogen, where nitrogen reductions may be beneficial. But this is based on the old data, and so we've had a lot of projects that might also
And again,
in future years.
Where's that normal for nitrogen or average? I
think I have to get, so the eutrophic range, I think is 1 point, or it's 0.75 to 1.5. I have that in the report.
Okay.
I don't have it up as I'm presenting, but most of the lakes fall within that eutrophic range, which just, and I would say we use that term to mean it's something really terrible, but most oligotrophic lakes are something like, Lake Superior, or
Mhm.
very, very clear lakes. Most of our lakes would fall even in what we would consider a really great condition, meeting our district goals of being, kind of mesotrophic.
If you could just add that, that kind of reference on this slideshow, this would be really good for presentation
Mhm.
with the Lake Association. That would be
Yeah, I can
helpful.
definitely do that. So that was my dive into nitrogen. That was this was the first time we've really dug into that, which was interesting to kind of look at how that might be impacting water quality. And we certainly can keep looking at some of that data moving forward. I won't spend too much time. We have information about fish and aquatic plants for both lakes. Nothing too surprising. It's something we talk about a lot as a board and manage separately. I think maybe something I found a little surprising, that there was a partial winter kill in Little Comfort Lake, but that was back in the mid 80s.
One thing about this, though, back from the very beginning report that started in 1998, and I think it was actually published in 2000, but there were some corrections that had to be made. So 2002 was the corrected version, but from that very point, the lack of natural plant or native plant in Comfort Lake was noticed.
Mhm.
And it's been reported like that for the last 20 years. So I'm curious what's causing that, because we, according to Steve McComas, we should have more native plant species.
Well, and actually, interestingly, in that more recent survey in 2019, there were more native species 5 years later.
Mhm.
And that may be part, and I think Steve has mentioned this Steve McComas, when he's presented on Eurasian water milfoil,
Mhm.
kind of has its initial colonization that could have had a big factor in decreasing the amount of native species. And as the native species just come into more of a equilibrium with Eurasian water milfoil, right? They come into some sort of balance long term.
Or it's treated.
And it's also treated. Yes. So
Yeah.
there's
And so we're
Oh,
knocking it out
yep.
like that too.
Mhm. Yep. And that gives more opportunity for the native species to
Okay,
thrive.
so I don't know when we're due for that next plant. What's it called? It's called the aquatic plant
a point
assessment or
intercept
something.
survey. Yeah.
Yeah, or assessment. Yeah, that's probably coming up in a couple of years. So we should pay close attention to that to see how that's improving.
Mhm.
And if it's not from Eurasian milfoil, which I think is getting under control here, then it's something else. It's got to be something else, and we've got to start looking at that.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it seems based on this 2014, 2015 to 2019, it would make sense to have another one in 2022 or 2023, kind of every
Okay.
5 years. Then there's a little bit about like sediment. We've talked about this because this was a separate study, the Paleo Core. So it's in the report. Just recall, we again have that large shift in sediment composition from the 1930s to 2005, which ties with that post World War II shift in agricultural practices, and we kind of see that in a lot of lakes in this area.
I was going to mention this when you were doing that first slide, where it had the process that we go through for our diagnostic work and so on. This was missing. And we don't do it on all lakes, but we do it on our major lakes so that we can set realistic goals. So I'd like to see you add that to that progression, because it's a very strong and purposeful underpinning to how we approach our lake goals.
That's true. That gets into that goal setting, which would be almost its own separate element. That's right. And I think as we went through the watershed management plan, have highlighted that as a separate effort.
Well, but it's part of the process, though, I guess, is what I'm talking about. So we have those arrows, pointing to the right, and you're talking about the process that we go through. This is an important step in that process.
I'll just point out, I just noticed something in the chat. Manager Spence had asked how often we typically update the point intercept surveys, and Garrett confirmed about 5 years.
Okay.
All right, so the Comfort Lake core, that phosphorus levels have declined since 1990s, so we've seen that improvement. But the present day accumulation rates, and this is that net amount of just what creates sediment in a lake. It's both inputs from the watershed and also just the algae and the production within the lake dying and decomposing. It's 3 times higher than we had in pre-settlement, and that just really shows the acceleration that humans have on, eutrophying lakes and increasing that whole process. And I think one thing we noted too that you'll see later in the report that I would highlight as the theme is the ditching of the wetlands was kind of a common theme of impacting this drainage area as opposed to some of the other areas in the district, just much more pronounced. So there may have been a lot of watershed and areas that didn't directly drain to the district lakes than they do now. It's much more connected. Little Comfort Lake, of course, actually, was it last Friday or the Friday before, Mark collected the core and his team of students from Little Comfort. And that core I'm very interested to see the results from. So recall that nearby School Lake, the phosphorus levels now are actually pretty close to pre-settlement levels, so hovering around 50 micrograms per liter. So the goal for School Lake, which is more of a shallow lake, but going down to 40 might not be achievable. And then as noted, School Lake has recovered from greater impairment based on that core data. And then when we get into the goals, you'll see that that core really will help decide what may be a feasible reduction strategy, although I've included a range of options. So we have that data when we get that core results. But from what I'm seeing, I might start to suspect that the pre-settlement concentrations might not be as low as 30, but I could be surprised. In terms of stratification, these are figures we now include in the water monitoring report, but just kind of differences between the two lakes. You'll see that Little Comfort Lake, its no oxygen zone in the bottom waters starts much shallower than Comfort Lake. So, and I think we see that would be a contributor to why internal loading is more of a factor for Little Comfort than for Comfort Lake. Zooming out then to the watershed, we spent some time trying to define specific subwatersheds, and we modified these a little bit, but you'll see we split the Comfort Lake Management District into 9 subwatersheds. One is landlocked, Ashton Lake, that's denoted with the hatching in the maps to help see that. The Little Comfort Lake Management District, again, has 7 subwatersheds. The Nielsen Lake, oh, I was blanking on the name, is also landlocked. And then note, and I have a footnote of this in the report, but the FL24 is another landlocked watershed right in between the 2 lake management districts. I think based on topography, if it overtopped, it likely would overtop to Forest Lake. I mean, these would be under extreme conditions and something we wouldn't see, wouldn't expect to see, actually. But I've included it just so it's not this little hole that wasn't covered in any other diagnostic study. So it was just to be complete, but it's a little bit of an outlier, but that's why it has the FL notation. But it's landlocked, so it doesn't contribute anyway. So it's just more for an academic summary. And we've talked about this a lot for the watershed management plan, but this theme of the land cover really dictates in terms of what we're seeing for phosphorus and sediment sources and implementation activities. But, the Comfort Lake Management District, that drainage area has a greater fraction of the developed areas, wetlands, wetted soils, and those altered water courses. There's a smaller proportion of uplands, but they have a greater impact relatively. And then really that significant hydrologic alteration of the large expanses of ditch wetlands kind of help understand why we might see higher sediment concentrations than you might expect from such a depressional landscape. Little Comfort Lake, of course, has a greater fraction of forests, pasture hay, drier soils, a little more upland, but it's very much a depressional landscape as well. So we have greater fraction of watercourses in that area that don't have a definable channel. And I know when we were doing the tributary monitoring and trying to investigate some of the little tributaries, they just kind of turn into groundwater. And so there's not many definable channels in that area. So less impacts from development. Oh, I misspelled that, apologize, but more from agricultural activity. And again, these are very localized since we go through that chain of lakes.
That's very important, though, this difference that you're talking about from a development standpoint and a planning standpoint at the city level, because understanding this topography, and I'm sure it has to do with soil types and other things, this is critical to help our cities not plan for areas that will create higher problems in the long run for our water bodies. And so I think this is a critical piece that we need to understand and make sure that we're sharing with our partners. The other thing about this too, before we leave it, is that we talked about the tamarack swamp or groves in the Little Comfort Lake area, but I didn't see that listed. And so if that's an important feature, we should mention that, because there's not very many of them left in Minnesota.
Oh, that's a good point. I actually want to make a note of that. I'm not sure how frequent that is or not. I can reach out to Jason on that. It's noted in that Heath Avenue wetland. You're correct.
Mm-hmm.
But some of those unique features that may be part of this, and we would have a lot of that information actually from the Greenway corridor. I'll reach out to Kevin and Jason. That would be an easy addition that will supplement this. All right, moving on. Or any more questions on land cover or anything previous? Good. In terms of phosphorus sources, I think so. There's a summary of the existing loads and you know, the relative contribution. So for phosphorus, you know, we have a sense of this from some of our monitoring data. It's been looked at in the past, but for Comfort Lake, and this is I'll be just working off the pie charts right now in my description. You can see that the Sunrise River Inlet really is the largest fraction of phosphorus load to Comfort Lake. That's why there's been that focus on the Sunrise Engineers Report. So that's about 3/4 of the total phosphorus load. In terms of existing loads, Little Comfort Lake contributes as well, 18%. And then you have some contributions from direct drainage, and that does include that little tributary that comes in on East Comfort Drive. And groundwater, though, is actually comparable to that direct drainage runoff. So that was one component we don't always include in our lake models, but groundwater is more of a dominant flow path in Comfort Lake. And we talked about that as we were walking through the watershed management plan, kind of that near surface interaction with groundwater. It's not what we think of with that deep groundwater, but there's just a lot of connection between kind of that subsurface, near surface groundwater and surface water runoff. It's that depressional wetland. There's the sandy soils near the Onoka sand plains. So I did account for some fraction of phosphorus coming just from groundwater. It'd be a lower concentration than surface runoff, but it still actually came out to be somewhat observable in a pie chart. Little Comfort Lake, similarly, the Itasca Avenue Inlet still is over half of the total load to the lake. It drains, it has a large drainage area. It's a large fraction of the flow, but the Heath Avenue Inlet is about 25%. And then internal load in Little Comfort Lake becomes a factor compared to Comfort Lake. And then again, direct drainage runoff, just by chance, is actually a very similar proportion, 4%. And then we get a little bit from the lake surface.
Megan, there are a couple of input sources that I didn't see in the report, and I just wondered if those were missed or what's going on with that. I think they're kind of significant. I don't know what the flow is. You're going to have somebody's going to have to measure it, but over on you had a map that showed inputs, and it was on the east side. And this is on Indian Avenue, right off of Pioneer. There's a significant stream. There's a fairly big complex wetland there. And the stream is coming from the Adlin Farm up by Pioneer. And then part of that was developed. And so there's 3 or 4 houses there, but big lots, 2-acre lots. And that all flows down into a wetland on the, it would be the south side of Indian Avenue. And then it goes under the road to this complex wetland, and it meanders through there and then comes out on the north end, the northeast end of Comfort Lake. And that's, you know, when there's rain events, it's very steady. It takes several days, even a couple of weeks even, to dry out without further precipitation. And I don't know that that's ever been monitored, but it would be interesting to measure that. The other big one is 260th, the ditch that runs along 260th, coming from the Comfort Oaks development, which is fairly high. And then it drops pretty significantly into the north end of Comfort Lake on the west side. And so it would be right about where the outlet is, you know, about 2 lots south of the outlet. And that needs to be looked at. The volume of the flow is significant in the spring and after a rain event. And then there's another ditch. This one's buried right along Iris. And that comes off of where the park is right there. There's a small wetland. It's a turtle habitat, but the flow comes out. It's open by the park, but then it's buried by the houses as it comes down to the southeast side of Comfort, where it almost meets Highway 8. And it flows through a wetland, but it goes directly into the lake after that. It's not held anywhere for treatment.
No, and thank you for the pointing those out. We were in our, you know, higher level view, and given the large area of the 2
Mhm.
major tributaries, we were focused in those areas. But I did know that you had mentioned some of those inlets. We did. This is a prep year for the diagnostic effort in Comfort, Little Comfort that's planned for next year. So we're doing Forest Lake this year. So some of the work that we do is kind of just that field recon to get a sense of where loggers should go. So we did put a logger on that East Comfort Drive, the Indian Trail
Mhm.
drainage area, because that does show within that direct drainage area. So it's massed within our estimates for direct drainage.
Mhm.
But to dig into within the direct drainage areas we can focus on, we did put a logger there to see kind of what those overall flows are, and we can check out the other
Mhm.
2 smaller ones. I'd be curious the one closer to the outlet. It doesn't appear that it would have much of a drainage area, but it's so flat through here. It could maybe under certain levels cross the boundary into that CL2 subwatershed. So that's interesting.
That
could
all
look
used
into
to be wetland, of course, down there, but on that lowland before the lake. But that's drainage from 2 developments, probably 50 plus houses at the top of the hill. So
No, I think when we get into, I'll skip back to here, kind of the reduction goals by source.
mhm.
In all my scenarios, you know, there's work to be done in that direct drainage area. So kind of digging into that feasibility assessment phase,
Okay.
looking at those will be important. Mhm.
Okay, so you
'Cause
captured it
there's-
in your overall modeling, but okay.
It's in
but
the
you need to get more
overall.
specific. Mhm.
Mhm.
Okay,
So we have an overall estimate of the total flow that could come from that drainage area. And I would say the concentration estimate was on the high end, so it'll be
Okay.
conservative to account for that. But in terms of where we focus specifically, if it's the shoreland or some of
Mhm.
those smaller tributaries areas, that'll be the next area to work within. Because
Mhm.
I do think for the Comfort Lake, you'll see when I was going through the goals that the district should set a goal for that direct drainage area for Comfort Lake. And that would be where those projects could come from.
Okay.
Mhm. Um, I just want to note, and this was actually a tough model. These are two tough models to calibrate for a lake water quality response model. And what I kept running into is the model, and I've built these models throughout the entire state, well over 100, and usually they're in impaired conditions. And this was one of the few cases where the model over predicts the in-lake phosphorus concentration. So then it comes to, the question of what is causing that? So there's two ways to adjust and calibrate the model. And these models are based on another background lake data set. So it's an empirical, basically, relationship between total phosphorus load and what we would predict the in-lake concentration to be. So that's important to note. So there'll be some variability. So we do some tweaking. So it over predicted it. So for Comfort Lake, and this was after a lot of discussion looking at the H&H model and the data, given the really close proximity of the Sunrise River inlet to the outlet, I did just dial that back a little bit in terms of total flow, just to account for under really high flows, maybe just right in the spring. A lot of that flow probably won't have a chance to really impact overall lake water quality. I didn't dial it back by a lot. It's still a large flow contribution, and still 74% of the total load. And then for both lakes, I did have to increase basically the phosphorus retention factor. So it basically adjusts for those two lakes have a lower in-lake concentration relative to total phosphorus loads compared to the empirical lake data set. So if 100 pounds of phosphorus went into a lake and you expect a certain amount of lake concentration, basically for this lake, I said you could have 165 pounds and you would see that same concentration. So it's another way to account for the fact that one, the empirical lake data set likely used land cover based loads, and we do a lot of monitoring. So we might actually be getting more accurate loads. So, we're getting the true measurement of loads because our data is based on monitoring data. A lot of these are based on land cover based models. So, and it was similar for both lakes. So Little Comfort Lake, I increased that sedimentation factor up to 1.75. And then it's a similar change, but in the Itasca Avenue tributary, I adjusted the concentration a little bit. There was one really high concentration that may have been increasing that overall average concentration. So it seemed within reason to try dialing that back a little bit. Many years, it's well below 60 parts per billion. So 96 seemed a little high as an average. So I decreased it to 74 to have a better sense of what the distribution of loads might be.
Could that be also because we're part of a river system and there's constant flow through, I should say?
Yeah, the residence time, although the residence time is part of that relationship. So that's built into the model.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this goes even above and beyond that.
Okay.
But yes, the amount of time water spends in the lakes is shorter than other areas because it has such a large drainage area. Mm-hmm. A lot of flow through.
Just one question, Megan. In previous years, I got the impression that there was a lot of sediment going into Comfort Lake. At least that's what I think Manager Anderson's been telling us, and I haven't looked at the data, but there's a lot of sediment going in there. Wouldn't that impact the potential for internal load buildup if that's settling on the bottom, et cetera, over time? And I'm kind of surprised to see there's no internal load on Comfort Lake at all. Now, you talked a little bit about that, but with all that sediment coming in there, I think that would have some impact on it, but I just wanted to raise the question.
Yeah, and it's a good question. So I think and I might get at this when I move into sediment sources. So there's sediment and then there's sedimentation. So the sedimentation rate, so how quickly the lake bottom and those lake sediments accumulate over time, which is both inorganic, but it's also organic. So if you have a really eutrophic lake, you're going to have much higher sedimentation rate of buildup. So that lake's going to fill in faster. All that algae growth, it dies and starts to fill up. And then there's also just, more contributions from the watershed. And that can be organic as well or inorganic. So, when all the depressional wetlands were ditched in the settlement period, that increased all the flow that goes into the lake. So you started to see that increase in sedimentation or the buildup of material that goes into the lake. They're just big depressions in the landscape. There are a lot of areas, and this is hard to see in the data, but there is a lot of sediment that gets discharged to Little Comfort and Comfort Lake, but it's flashy in nature is one of the things we noticed. So when we did kind of take a deep dive into this aspect, since it's come up as an area of interest for the board that we haven't dug into much in other areas. But we can look at our monitoring data and just see how the total sediment load and the average concentration changes as along the subwatersheds, which are in series along the Sunrise River inlet and then in the Little Comfort drainage area. And I think one thing to note, and I'll highlight these in the next slide in the map, so you can kind of carry forward what we see from the monitoring data from what I'm going to show you in terms of the erosion and depressional areas. But so the CL4 subwatershed, which is Bixby Park to Shallow Pond, we saw really high sediment loads in 2011, 2012. Now we don't always see that high. So some years have much higher sediment loads. So that's when we get that flashy hydrology. And one of the observations, Blaine has observed this and EOR staff when they've been out looking at all these ditched wetlands, there's several feet of unconsolidated sediment in all these channelized wetland ditches. So, things just kind of accumulate. It's a depressional area, but it's really during those large rainfall events that we're probably getting a lot of these contributions. So in really wet rainfall years, a lot of that accumulated sediment can then get mobilized if it's just a really large rain event. So we might have one really high concentration following a rain event, but the rest of the year are a little lower. And so then we see a lot of variability in kind of that sediment load compared to phosphorus, which is still variable, but maybe not as variable. Sediment's a little harder in the fact that it can be flashy like that.
So we have point sources. We have intermittent point sources of pollution.
In a way, yeah.
With these legacy ditches, is what you're saying. And that's where the sediment load, and we do have a lot of sediment load on Comfort compared to the other lakes. So there's no question about that.
It has a larger drainage area. Yep.
Yes. Yeah.
So the CL3 subwatershed, and we keep focusing on this one, that's Shallow Pond. And I would say after a thorough review of all this data and the assessment, in the works long-term for the district is this Shallow Pond restoration. It is currently acting as a sink for both sediment and phosphorus. And it is, so it's doing its job as kind of being that collection area, treating a lot of that Sunrise River, but there definitely in the future should be plans to do some improvements to that. And I think the study, if I have one of my themes, that would be a theme, that still is a priority for the district. It's in the engineer's report. It's kind of down the road because it's currently a sink, but I think it's still something that should be planned for. And there are, Blaine's been out there with city staff. There are options to do it. It doesn't have to be a huge capital project. I think little things can help a lot in that area. And again, that's another area of focus in that Greenway visioning as well. So.
I didn't see you mention the tax forfeit property. I mean, it was mentioned a little bit, but not really talked about in depth as a method to slow down and treat some of this flow that's coming through, maybe even sediment, I don't know. But we've got those ditches, that are coming out of the city with untreated stormwater. And there's an opportunity with the tax forfeit land in particular to treat that. I'm talking about the stuff coming from Washington County, Forest Lake City. if you look at the one map that's showing the altered ditches and the, the ditches systems, and the altered courses and so on, you'll
Mhm.
see that JD2, the old JD2, which has been abandoned. So we shouldn't represent it as that anymore. But anyway, it comes all the way from basically Cub Foods, it looks like, down to Comfort Lake in a pretty straight line. A little curve here and there, but pretty straight, actually. So we have to do something about that stormwater because it's still coming down through the old ditch systems. It's not being treated in any way. And we know from the Banta project report that you did, there's a lot of things other than nitrogen and phosphorus in that water.
Yeah, and we can skip around a little bit because I think, the board's familiar with this area. We're starting to launch into areas we've been discussing in more detail. So, so thinking of the sediment sources and jumping forward, I put the tax forfeit in the phosphorus reduction category, but you're right. Again, it's still increasing storage, it's volume reduction. That's a key benefit. Just in terms of accounting, we have the specific phosphorus reduction goals. The tax forfeit, that's where that project fell. But you're absolutely right. So then in the implementation plan, just the larger goals. So to treat that sediment and the things that I was just describing, really is that focus on that increasing the water storage, that regional stormwater treatment, which we've had as a program. We've moved it forward. And I think what this report will do is just give that support and the scientific basis for why we're doing all of those projects. So I did want to point out, and these were ones that were described in part in the Greenway Visioning Workshop, but recall too that Greg and others are working on that regional stormwater treatment study. So one of the areas is this forest lake conservation area. And I think that helps treat a lot of, well, it might be, this is actually maybe a little upstream. I think the JD2 comes from
my
a little
point was
further downstream. Yep.
Yeah, my point was though that I didn't see that really brought out in the diagnostic study as a source of excess quantity, untreated stormwater, that kind of thing, unless I missed it. So I just think that it's something that needs to be mentioned in a diagnostic study, which should be comprehensive.
It is. And I think it's maybe hidden in, I'm sorry if this, everybody close your eyes as I flip through slides. It's within the CL8 subwatershed is kind of where we focus. And this was the point of some of the erosion depressional areas we're trying to understand. So we have CL8. It often has high concentrations of sediment compared to other areas. The amount of erosion areas, if you just looked at topography, is actually still kind of low. It's not like there's banks that are eroding, I guess is the point. But that's the developed area. So it helps us know where the source is. But it also has lower relative to the whole area. This is this lighter blue amount of storage, so deposition areas. CL7 is where Bixby Park is. CL4 is the tax forfeit. And the Descharmes area. And then of course we have the shallow pond. So that's the CL8 watershed is where we've been focusing our regional treatment and it downstream of it.
Yeah, I can't see that, but that's further south.
The CL8?
Yeah.
This is the spot in the bottom left. That's the most upstream subwatershed.
Okay,
but you're right. That's the urban area.
My videos were over there. Okay, gotcha.
I know it can be. Things pop up all over.
Yeah.
Well, so this has the high impervious. This is where we get that flashy hydrology. So a lot of the projects in that forest lake conservation areas downstream of this, we have Bixby that's downstream of us and tax forfeit. So we're putting our storage downstream of that area, but its primary purpose is to treat that. There's some smaller local projects that we identified. In the Cub Foods area, you're right. That's something that Greg has his eye on. We called it the market area because there's many other stores in that system. But you're right. And so when we're targeting, if you will, this is one of those areas that needs volume treatment But our practices are sometimes a little further downstream. So I think some of our practices fall in this CL7 subwatershed.
Okay.
But yeah, we agree. And the data support it based on what we're seeing with slopes and depositional areas and land cover. Mhm.
Well, yeah, the point I guess I'm making here is that all of that area is pretty flat. I mean, you just really don't see a lot of upland, you know, a little bit of rise here and there, but the point is that this old ditch system is still being used as the outlet for stormwater. And so we just need, and I didn't see that really called out clear enough for me in the report. So, and I'm sure that there's a place where you can just maybe enhance the language a little bit to make that tie-in, because this becomes the document to talk with Wyoming and Forest Lake about following their MS4 mandates.
I made a note of that because I agree with your description of that. We described the ditch wetlands more in their original purpose was to try to drain the land for agriculture, but you're right,
Mhm.
correct. Now they also serve as stormwater conduits, even though that wasn't their intended purpose. And it's good to
I wouldn't say
know.
now they also serve. I would say that now they do serve that purpose. There's hardly any farms left, you know, in
Right.
this area. I think there's
Mhm.
2 in Wyoming, and nobody's farming in this area that I know of in Washington County. They're
Mhm.
selling it all off. So we have to have a correct documentation so that we can frame it properly for our cities.
That'll help with the corridor discussion as well.
Mhm.
All right, I've made that note. So I'll jump to, we did phosphorus sources. So jumping to the goals, and this is what I mentioned. I wanted just to talk it through a little bit. I think the only thing I want to show, highlight in this table is just in terms of time. For Little Comfort, the reduction scenarios, of course, change if our target's 30 versus 40. So basically, you can just see if we're trying to reach an in-lake concentration of 30, we need to reduce loads by 47%. If we're aiming for 40, it's 23%. So there's some range depending on what the goal target is. So I want to focus on these 2 slides. This is more of a summary trying to piece together some aspects of the report that I have in more detail in the actual report. But just if we were to, you know, put one slide up here, I just want to walk you through the scenarios for Little Comfort and Comfort because they're related. So within the red circle, what I'm showing for each lake, so the 3 bars on the top are the reduction scenarios by source for Little Comfort Lake. So it's the total amount of phosphorus reduction we need. And you can see on the right, the top right, I have my key. So the direct drainage area is in blue. So it's a very small bar on the very top. It's hard to see because it's a very small fraction of the total load for Little Comfort. The Itasca Avenue Inlet is in red, and that's the one I want you to keep your eye on. The Heath Avenue Inlet is in green, and the internal load reduction needs are in purple. So I think, you know, from the get-go, you can see depending on your scenario, and the bars on the left are for Little Comfort to achieve 30 micrograms per liter. The middle one is 33, and the right one is for 40. So you can see internal load reductions, Heath Avenue reductions, I set as the same. It's relatively the same across all 3 scenarios. Where we get our differences, how low how low can we get that Itasca Avenue Inlet? So like I mentioned before, its current concentration is 74. The ecoregion baseline is 100. So I think the one thing I wanted to note is I did do the scenario. So to get the Little Comfort Lake all the way down to 30 micrograms per liter, Itasca Avenue would have to be down to 43.
Whoa.
I set Heath Avenue at 100 just because that's a, you know, more developed area, you know, so the total load we would need could come from either source. We could maybe get below 100 at the Heath Avenue Inlet and need less from Itasca. But I think the point is at least one of those 2 tributaries would have to go below even what the ecoregion baseline is for a stream. So that's where I start to wonder if what the pre-settlement condition might be for Little Comfort Lake. And it could be 30, and then that just shows us how altered this area might be from those conditions. But it was a little surprising to me. And, you know, in terms of goal setting, we don't want the district to spend you know, just as much money to get down to 30 as you did to 40 or even more, right? That 80-20 rule. So that's why there were those three scenarios, because it became clear right near the beginning that 30 might be hard to achieve and we might have to spend a lot of extra dollars to get really low concentrations. How that relates then to Comfort Lake, and the reason this is all in one slide. So the Comfort Lake reduction scenario is down below. Now we can achieve 30, we're very close, and it's a consistent 10% reduction from all the sources is where we're at right now. It's 193 pounds per year. But it depends on how low we go with Little Comfort. So if we get Little Comfort all the way down to 30, that's most of the load reduction we need for Comfort Lake to get to 30 micrograms per liter. So we need some reduction from the Sunrise River Inlet and the direct drainage area, but it's less so. It's maybe on the order a little over 50 pounds. If Little Comfort can only get to 40, then we need more reduction from the Sunrise River Inlet at West Comfort Drive and the direct drainage area. So then we need maybe about 140 pounds from the watershed. So in the bottom graph, you know, paying attention to the blue bars, which is basically the reduction that Little Comfort provides for Comfort Lake, versus the red bars, which is the Sunrise River Inlet. Basically, it's a trade-off. If we get a lot of reductions and Little Comfort, you know, maybe with our projects plus the alum treatment, it might go down to 30, and that'll have a big impact on Comfort Lake water quality. If we don't get that low, then, you know we need to put more effort in the direct drainage area and the Sunrise River Inlet. And I would say for my scenarios, just because the direct drainage area is a much smaller area, I set that to a consistent reduction similar to Heath Avenue and Little Comfort Lake.
Mhm.
So it's something that is manageable and an achievable goal.
Where are you getting the eco-region baselines of 100 for Heath Avenue and Itasca? Where's that come from?
These are based on, so this, it was used to develop the lake water quality standards and then also for the stream eutrophication standards. So for the central region, which we're in, kind of what they consider the ecoregion baseline for stream phosphorus concentrations is 100. So I kind of use that, and when I do TMDLs as well, just to help know if I'm setting a reasonable goal or not. Urban areas isn't a forested landscape, so I don't often like to set the goal lower than 150. That seems a really low, you know, runoff concentration from an urban area. But for a forested landscape, 100 micrograms per liter would be a reasonable target. It's not a golden rule. It's not a hard and fast number, but it just gives a sense of, you know, if we set a stream concentration goal for 20 micrograms per liter, that might be too low. So it's always good. We can say what load reductions are, but I always want to show what that might be in terms of concentration relative to its flow, just to know really what we're aiming for.
Heath Avenue isn't really a stream though. That's a drainage ditch.
Right, and that's why
and a
I did.
tiled system. So that
Yep.
that really isn't the proper measurement, is it?
Well, I would actually then put it higher. So yes, you're right. It's a much more altered system, but so I left that goal at 100 micrograms per liter. And this is where there's some art to a load reduction scenario for lakes and why it can be adaptive, right? The lake needs a total load reduction. It doesn't really know where it comes from. It's just all well mixed during the growing season. It impacts water quality. So what these numbers I think are useful for is, you know, we can start to see how much progress we make on Little Comfort Lake and from which sources. And then that will also impact then where our focus needs to be for Comfort Lake. And so I've set our starting scenario under that 40 microgram per liter goal, just because in my mind, it's a reasonable starting place in terms of adaptive management. It's kind of an intermediate step for Little Comfort Lake until we know from the Paleo Corps that, you know, 30 is something we should strive for. And then those load reductions are pretty well distributed amongst the three sources.
Well,
and actually
40 is what we have now for our 20 lake or 20-year in lake total phosphorus goal. There's a 10-year at 40 and a 20-year at 40. Obviously, we didn't get started on this one until the first 10 years, the first decade was gone when we started this. But so in the second decade, 40 is the goal, the current goal. So we're there already, aren't we? I mean,
For-
we've already established that.
For
So
Little
you got-
Comfort Lake?
Yeah. So you're talking about the long-term in like
Correct.
total phosphorus goal
Yeah.
of 30?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I don't have a problem with that, long-term goal staying at 40, but we won't know anything
Mhm.
until the paleo diagnosis comes in.
Yep.
So if we continue to stay at our 20-year goal, then we're already there. We've accommodated for that.
Yeah, and the one thing too, so with Little Comfort Lake, relying less on Little Comfort Lake for Comfort Lake is also a good strategy because it puts more effort in the Comfort Lake strict drainage area,
Mhm.
right? Then you don't have those two lakes so tightly linked. And then we have kind of basically an independent approach for Comfort Lake. So then there's a more even distribution in terms of our load reduction goals for the Sunrise River, direct drainage, and Little Comfort Lake.
Yeah.
So then that's how the implementation plan is laid out, and it has a lot of project, and it's based on sub-watershed. A lot of them, of course, we've seen already. That this was a study that's basically come on the tails of a lot of different elements. I think some of the new things you might see, we have fleshed out as part of the regional stormwater treatment, that Heath Avenue outlet wetland improvement that's right along Highway 8. And this intersection is going to change. I think there's a lot of opportunity to treat some of that Heath Avenue outlet water. And then we have that new Little Comfort implementation grant, which really gets us a big step for Little Comfort Lake in terms of the School Lake outlet channel restoration, the alum treatment, and also the Heath Avenue east wetland restoration.
Good.
In Comfort Lake, and I'll go through in the summary
Can
too.
you go back?
Mhm.
I'm sorry, just a minute. Can you go back to that last slide? Yeah. So Heath Avenue, can you just explain this one for me? Where is this?
So the Heath Avenue drainage area is
The one on the
basically
left. No, I'm talking
Oh,
about the
this
particular
is
one on the left. Yeah.
so there's if you're going south on Heath Avenue, and this is where we did our monitoring for that Heath Avenue outlet pipe. This is the drop structure that
Okay. I know where that's at. No.
Mhm.
This farm just recently sold, so there's no livestock on that anymore that I know of. I mean, there were goats, nothing serious.
Oh, really?
but-
No,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh,
So
well,
there's no goats anymore, and I don't know if they're planning to reintroduce them, but there's nothing there now.
probably
I
not.
think they had
Well,
chickens and goats. That's all I ever saw there.
sister can check one off the list then.
Livestock management done.
Exactly. So you'll see that as a small element, but it was just going to be implemented through district staff time and coordination. So there,
Okay.
done. Good to know.
Mhm.
And then I just highlighted, and a lot of this was already from that Heath Avenue feasibility study, but
There
There's
was
that-
something that I wanted to point out though on
Mhm.
Heath Avenue. So are we still talking about Heath? No, not really? Okay. Let
we
me
are.
just go.
Mhm. Yep.
Okay. So if you go down to the corner of Heath and Highway 8, the previous slide, I think, showed the wetland area where the flow is just going unchecked right now. Yeah, this treatment area. Right across Heath from that, which you can't see, just maybe a little corner of. There's 4 acres for sale right there. And I'm sure it's part of the Applewood Nursery that's going to be moving over to Pioneer. I wondered if that area had any value for treatment, like storm treatment coming out of that portion of the Heath Avenue area. And if it does, from an engineering standpoint, then and maybe you don't have the answer right now, but we should be talking with the city about protecting that area.
No, I know Greg has thought about taking some of that drainage area and routing it to this basin structure, but I'll run that past him of another option. I think he was focusing where we thought we might be
Yeah.
more likely to get access, but that's interesting to think about running it the other way. I know we thought about trying to close this loop, so the outlet pipe essentially drains that whole area, but there's a lot of depression. So if we crossed it back over Highway 8 back into all those depressions and made it
Well,
essentially
not
do the
Highway
system
8,
again.
not Highway 8. I'm talking about going back across Heath Avenue. So it'd be
Yeah.
the bottom left corner.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. And actually, so I think the plans are to change the intersection to more of a 90-degree. So a lot of
Right.
that area will now be accessible to this basin. So we designed it based on its current
Mhm,
configuration, but I think the most recent
mhm.
plans, and this was from, I think, the public comment period for that whole area
Mhm.
website, is to have it at 90 degrees, and that would move a lot of that area. So yeah,
Well,
and
we should,
Greg,
this is more for our staff, I guess, is that,
Yeah.
you know, we need to be alert to that being available.
Mhm.
And it's been up now for probably 8 months at least. So let's see if there's any value for water projects there, and we should be in touch with the city of Wyoming.
all right, anything else in the Heath Avenue?
Nope.
I'll pass along to Greg and district staff. I know we're always talking about these areas, so it's be part of our discussion for these projects. I think then, so moving to Comfort Lake, and I have it laid out by subwatershed. So we're starting in the direct drainage, and recall that, and essentially all three scenarios, it's a 26 pound per year reduction goal. I think we should aim for. You know, this was one of the areas we had talked about with the, you know, shoreline surveys and more targeted outreach pilot program. You know, we have now a load reduction we could aim for, and there's been a lot of development on this shoreline, so maybe some opportunity as well. It's not as developed as the Forest Lake shoreline. And then there's some just kind of better understanding, I think, and I've included this, we should keep our eye on the bottom phosphorus concentrations in Comfort Lake. Bone Lake and Comfort Lake are the two lakes that, you know, it does have some small seasonal increases. I don't think it's impacting water quality right now. So I don't recommend an alum treatment or going in that direction, but it could in the future, 10 years from now. So it's something just to, I've including it in the lake monitoring plan to continue collecting those bottom phosphorus concentrations. You know, depending on how much progress we make with Little Comfort and Comfort, and we decide we need to know that hydrologic relationship, you know, we can look into partnering with some research group. It could be a student project. It would be a very interesting study for them, something maybe the district doesn't have to take on all by themselves to kind of better understand that hydrology. And then I just highlighted kind of in that 2021 diagnostic, or it is 2021, 22 diagnostic period. You know, there's the few little inlets that relative to two large tributaries aren't as large, but within that direct drainage reduction goal, we could find projects and get some treatment. So it's not solely linked to the shoreline restorations. In the next subwatershed up, this is where, you know, there's been an area for maybe some rehabilitation of the Sunrise River channel, and then, you know, upstream of this whole area, there's the shallow pond restoration. Both those areas are getting some attention, that Greenway visioning, so it's moving into more of that feasibility phase. And then of course we have our tax forfeit wetland project. And that would, in my mind, help us get towards that phosphorus reduction goal. And then we move to kind of the, you know, there's not, because it's, as I mentioned, the sediment sources are based on more flashy hydrology. So it's not as easy to quantify, oh, we want 1,000, you know, pounds of sediment reduction from that whole drainage area, but really focusing on improving the storage in the area. So that's where we have that Forest Lake Conservation Area. This is downstream of the outlet. We have the Highway 61 regional pond that in the image on the right. This is an area Greg's been focusing on. It contributes to this kind of Greenway area wetland restoration that Kevin showed in the Greenway workshop. So on the image on the left, the interchange with Highway 8 and 61, that's what we're looking at on the image on the right. This is that southeast corner. So there's a pipe from the city's stormwater infrastructure that outlets, and it's more of, you can even see in the aerial, more of just a ditch that runs then across Highway 8, but there's opportunity to really expand this as a treatment basin and increase storage of some of that stormwater that discharges from this outlet pipe.
So if you go to the picture on the left,
Mhm.
where you have the blue arrows, lines coming, is that a structure to take the water from that man-made ditch and reintroduce it to the wetland?
So the man-made, so this drainage from the image on the right kind of goes diagonally from the bottom left to the top right. That's what contributes.
No, I'm talking
you
about
see
this
my-
one. You're right. Yep.
Yeah, can you see my cursor?
Yes, I can.
Yep, this is where that crosses under Highway 8 and contributes to this wetland. So there would be some pre-treatment in the south side of
Mhm.
Highway 8. And then there would be the wetland restoration for the rest of the drainage.
Okay, so those little blue arrows or little blue structures are culverts, or there's one up here in the middle as you go
This
north?
one,
Yeah. Mhm.
I think that is, this is within the wetland, so that's some sort of feature, I
Okay.
think. I'm not sure. You're right. There's some arrows going to it. I don't understand Kevin's
Well,
design in
I
detail,
think
but
that's, if that's to reintroduce that so that we're diminishing the impact of that
mhm.
untreated stormwater. That's really what he's saying.
Yep,
I
yep.
think.
This might be more of a trail, so they'd have to cross it. Maybe that's what that's showing. There's some drainage from the wetland, but yep, the downtown runoff comes from the south here.
Mhm.
Contributes to the wetland. Yep,
Well,
this would all
we'll-
just be direct runoff.
Oh, well, that's not good then. Okay, we'll talk to.
Yeah.
We should make that note for Greg, and it's more of an engineering project, but.
Yeah, so
can't-
this is a great spot to do some additional treatment. And of course, but Bixby's on the other side, so it kind of help get.
These
area.
inputs, though, don't come through Bixby.
No,
That's the point.
Yep.
This is a separate discharge.
correct. Yep.
And
Mhm.
there's about 4 or 5 more along Highway 8 as well.
Mhm.
Okay.
The other one thing I'll note is the Broadway Avenue Basin expansion. This is something the city is considering. We are monitoring it this year. And so this might be an area, if they're going to expand that basin to help treat more of their downtown area, you know, partnering with that Iron Hand Sand again would
Mhm.
seem a very cost-effective project to put into place. These
Can
areas
that-
are hard to treat.
Now, when you say expansion, do you mean expanding the amount that it's going to treat, or another pond?
I believe that, and Greg would know this for sure, so I shouldn't speak definitively.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding is they would just expand the footprint of the pond and not have a separate basin.
Okay.
But the point that the system, and if they have a different cell or it's one combined cell in the upgrade, is that it would treat more volume.
Okay.
And it would go through the same filter system. So keeping that in the Iron Hand Sand would be important. And we're measuring some of the flow through that system this year, and then also just collecting grabs to see what phosphorus concentration is coming out of that Iron and Hand Sand filter media. So
Okay.
Iron and Hand Sand is pretty easy to see if it's working or not. If it's working, it should be well below 100 parts per billion. So we should get some grabs to confirm that. If it's higher than that, that would have some indication that maybe it's not functioning as originally intended, and would give weight towards a need to replace that Iron and Hand Sand.
Shouldn't we be doing an expanded panel of chemicals, though, for reporting like we did on the Banta property? It's not just phosphorus we're looking at here. It's all of the other metals and other things that come off of untreated stormwater from an
True.
urban area.
And I think volume serves as a nice proxy for that. Going through a sand filter will also remove a lot of those, right, kind of our non-traditional
Mhm.
stormwater pollutants. Yeah, and by targeting a greater volume of that runoff from the downtown area would also achieve those goals. Yep.
But even for this project that you're showing on the left here with this, yeah, that we need to
Certainly.
understand what's coming through. There's a direct, this pathway is kind of blocking it, but there is a diagonal right through that wetland area where this path is, that comes from Highway 61 all the way up to where the 2 red dots are at the north of this area. And that's where that ditch joins the Sunrise. And that's all stormwater coming in from off of the city.
Yeah, this would miss that, but mhm.
Yeah, it's after. It's before.
And so again, these, looking at all the areas and the potential, that these are kind of the best options. And then, moving these through in further design, then we start to hit that next level. And that's where some of those other areas might pop out as options. The last thing I'll just point out then in terms of the stormwater treatment, if you spend time really digging into that 2012 report, there was a really extensive list of all these small little BMPs that could be implemented, kind of those urban retrofit projects. We've looked at those in detail. A lot of things have changed since that first was completed. So the landscape's changed. Some of them have been implemented as part of permitting projects or other, the Target Big Box picked off a few. So we kind of just for posterity's sake inventoried what essentially had been completed and then just highlighted really where we think the best of the best is from that list remaining. So, there's opportunities for rain garden retrofits just east of Bixby along this 8th Avenue Northwest and Schilling Circle, with some potentially high load reductions, just given kind of the configuration of that road. And then again, that Forest Lake Market area, which Manager Anderson, you mentioned as well, that Cub Foods area, and it's next to the district-owned property wetland. But, definitely treatments needed in that area. That could be kind of the next big box project that the district looks into. There's one other small, it's a little school parking lot, and I think the road next to it's slated for some improvements in the future. It doesn't have a very high phosphorus reduction, but it's just something Greg's keeping his eye on as being a potential project.
What reference was that list? Where do you have that in the report?
These retrofit practices?
Yeah.
This is probably the last section of the implementation plan. So it starts with the little comfort reduction, the comfort reduction, then we have the stormwater treatment, and I end with the kind of a summary of these stormwater retrofit opportunities.
Okay.
So maybe 3.3.
332.
332, thank you.
Yep.
And then in the appendix, we did bring forward that original information from the Sunrise Engineers report, just so you don't have to keep opening that large document to get at those original maps. Puts these into context.
Yeah, and you quantified the improvement as well?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Good.
Yep. So there's more detail in all of those. And again, these are things that Greg has his eye on for the regional treatment. So then getting near the end, just wanted to point out, I have one map that has pins for all of the projects. We've implemented the new naming convention to be related to the subwatershed, so we don't have to rely so heavily on parcel names, and then they basically get a letter in terms of order. And then there's the implementation table Emily and I need to work through in our watershed management plan revisions. So if there's anything we want to change based on these recommendations, but it's a big table and you could probably, after looking at it for a while, kind of come to these conclusions. But I thought I'd just walk you through kind of projects in terms of order so you could see where they fall. So, our in progress work are the 2 existing grants. So I'm just highlighting those right now. That's something we're working on now to complete next year. In terms of then the next 2 period, you kind of have a chunk of work that can be done in 2022, 2023. These are a lot of just the more agricultural livestock management. So there's not a lot of large costs to these. I'll point out in the July Avenue area, it might end up being just buffers that help treat some of that livestock area. So, we have larger costs to account for if there were maybe some larger, manure settling pond implemented. Or we do pursue some of these drain wetland restorations that are actually in that same area. But there's a lot of landowners, and those pros and cons are weighed in the report. But otherwise, these are basically just staff time or some, that project to look at hydrology in the Little Comfort Lakes. So that's kind of the next couple years out. I would say then, within still that first 5-year time period of the plan, then we get a kind of another set of larger projects. I think that Heath Avenue outlet wetland improvement at Highway 8 and Heath Avenue, that would be the appropriate time period that might be implemented. We have to wait till that road gets reconstructed. And then also that Broadway Avenue Basin expansion. And it's also dependent on when the city decides to implement that. And then kind of getting more into the mid-range of the next 10-year plan, then we have these projects, that Forest Lake Conservation Area, the Highway 61 Regional Pond Improvements. There's a lot of landowners. There's going to be a lot of moving parts to get into motion to implement those. Likely that'd be around the mid-year point. And then we get to the second half of the next 10-year plan, and that's where I would put those Sunrise River shallow pond restoration projects that wouldn't be something I think we'd focus on the first 5 years. Again, that's part of that Greenway visioning piece as well. So, time to get those landowners and agreements in place before we can do anything. And then there's some that are just annual programs, so stuff that just happens every year, and that's highlighted. But then moving forward, just to point out again, we're doing more of the recon. Blaine's doing DIY measurements. Plus, we still have our long-term monitoring, but it's 2022 that we would hit Comfort and Little Comfort again in terms of diagnostic monitoring. So there'll be opportunity to get some of these smaller tributaries and ditch network areas, since a lot of the sites are still covered by the ISO, so it gives us more opportunity with just loggers to get other sites. We have the Little Comfort Paleo Core study that'll be coming out. In terms of feasibility, I think the next steps, district staff will be kind of taking on that shoreline survey and prioritization over the next several years. There's the Indian Trail and those other little subwatershed areas, depending on the monitoring data. There'll be opportunities there. And then kind of more of those feasibility studies related to the Sunrise River corridor, shallow pond being one of those. And then currently, of course, we have designed the Little Comfort implementation, the tax forfeit, and then our effectiveness monitoring of the Broadway Avenue Basin and Target Big Box. So it's kind of what's in the works right now from that plan.
Okay.
Any more questions on the overall report? Anything else you want me to include?
I don't know about including, but the chart that I just asked about, the 3.3.2, all the BMP projects. So I found it, but it doesn't have a total. Could you total those columns so that we see what the aggregate is for BMPs?
Yes, that's a good point. Yep, I can do that in terms of capital cost and then the recurring costs. Yep.
Well, not the costs, not that so much. What I was talking about is the reduction in sediment, phosphorus, nutrient loading, that kind of thing, or outflow. What are we saving there?
I would say I would have a good estimate for the phosphorus from what's in here. The volume is a little harder to quantify and would be based on modeling for each project, but I can definitely do that some.
Yeah. Just as an aside on a bigger level, though, when we're looking at the reductions that we've enjoyed in our lake areas and our work that we've done to date, we haven't quantified what the effect of our rules have been. And we talked about this, I know, in the past, but I talked to the St. Anthony laboratory folks who usually do that stormwater work, and they were saying that we should have all that information when a permit is issued, and you just do the calculation for the what would have flowed off of the property without the BMPs in place. So I don't know if that's true or not, but if it is true, then we have the start of quantifying the value of BMPs in our rules.
And we do have some of that.
Yeah.
I know district staff has gone back. We've just reviewed their estimates, but Emily and others have gone back to look through all the old permits to pull what we can.
Mhm.
Some of the smaller erosion control don't have very significant, or they didn't have, it's really only if you trigger the stormwater rule that they have the calculations done.
Yeah.
Those are incorporated in the progress report. And maybe Emily has a chat describing it.
Yep.
Yes, the estimates for all the stormwater management features, and she's
Well,
confirming it's not for the
stormwater
erosion.
management is what would control the
Correct.
sediment and phosphorus loading. So isn't it one and the same?
Essentially, right. What for the erosion sediment control, that would be not recurring. That would be just any load that would come from the construction. So erosion and sediment control just mitigate any
Mhm.
loads that would be temporary, if you will, but still would contribute to our water bodies. So we don't have that quantification, but for the sites where we have an improvement in overall stormwater treatment that would be into the future, we have
Mhm.
estimates of those. And it's in, for each lake, it's summarized in the completed projects tables. So
All right,
we do
maybe-
have those
maybe-
estimates, and Emily could maybe direct managers to where that is.
Yeah.
For some of the areas, it's become significant. So
Mhm.
Mhm.
Well, I would imagine it would be. It's a good number to have when you're talking to anyone about the value of having your rules in place.
mhm, most
Because
definitely.
we wouldn't have achieved this level of success without having good enforcement of our rules and good compliance with our rules, because you're correcting the past, but you're getting new inputs. So anyway,
Exactly. Mhm.
so I have a couple of comments overall, if you're done with the report.
Yep.
Okay.
I'm ready.
Okay. The picture that you had at the beginning of your slideshow, and then there was one further in where you talked about, I think it was Big Comfort Lake shoreline work and so on. Those are actual pictures of Comfort Lakes. The picture on our draft plan is the same picture that was on the Forest Lake diagnostic plan. And so that's not familiar to me. That looks like it might be something over on Forest Lake, maybe an input stream or something. But I do think that we need to have a distinct picture of Little Comfort and Big Comfort on the cover of the diagnostic report.
You're right. I did never go back and change that picture.
Yeah. I was never a fan of combining these two. As a matter of fact, when you talked about this earlier, I don't remember what month it was, but when you talked about having them ready together, I did not take that to mean that they were going to be combined. I thought they would be distinct reports ready at the same time. And so I was a little frustrated when I first saw it. The information is good. I just don't like it combined. The watersheds are distinct enough that they require, detail on each one of them. And in too many pages, it's all conflated, so you get to a section or an area and it's talking about Big Comfort, then it's talking about Little Comfort. And sometimes it's, it's going back and forth. Other times they're distinctly separate. So I find that a little difficult when you want to look at just one or the other. As far as the lakes being hydrologically connected, that's not the way it was in the beginning, if you look at the early maps. And so this was clearly something that was man-made. And so when you make that statement in the executive summary, it's the last paragraph, I think a little bit of history there is warranted. So you can add just a sentence that talks about how that occurred. The other thing is that when the culvert was replaced, that's got to be 3 years ago now, at least. The culvert was so crushed that there was barely anything flowing through. And so when it was replaced with a new culvert, there was a lot more interaction, a lot more flow coming in from Little Comfort to Big Comfort. And that's when we started seeing those big flotillas of filamentous algae come in. And everyone's noticed that on the lake, just so that you know. It's not just here, on the end, at the southern end where I'm at, it's the northern end has noticed that as well. And it gets stuck in the bays and and it gets stuck on, whatever plant materials are growing near the shoreline. So it has been a real problem. So let's not avoid that, because people are going to be looking for answers on that one. We talked about Forest Lake and the stormwater there. I would have liked to have seen more information about the stormwater outlets that are coming into the Big Comfort Management District, and I'm not even sure, there may be some coming into Little Comfort from those southern sub-watersheds. So it's important to recognize the fact that we've got a tremendous amount of untreated stormwater coming in to the Comfort Lake Management District, and from one county to another. The judicial ditch systems, that's important. We call it the Sunrise River, which is great. But just some mention that this was an abandoned agricultural ditch. Just for the historical reference, you've got that great historical chart, which is good. There's only a couple of things on there that I saw needed to be added to, but other than that, it's really nice to have that, as you pointed out. But I do think that it's warranted to have a paragraph talking about the urban stormwater problem. And there's some of that coming from the city of Wyoming, but Forest Lake's been the big driving force over the last 30 years. So we just have to make certain that gets its due. It's due, because it has been a problem for the volume, the quantity of water in the past. I mentioned the ditching of the wetlands for agricultural purposes, and now it's all being converted to urban or suburban or rural housing developments. So at some point, if this is a point source during high rain events, we have to address this, because that sediment load is not going to go away without addressing that issue. And there are, most of the time, there are natural wetland areas that are being protected in these developments. And I'm just wondering if we can't look at rerouting some of those old ag ditches to the nearest stream or water body and reconnecting them to the wetlands that are already available on those properties. We talked about some of the tamarack swamp. We've got that covered. I think that was it. The only other thing on the Highway 8 issue, I mentioned the culvert, between the two lakes. The other thing that we have, of course, coming in is we have the flow from Highway 8 coming into the ditch systems and then entering both Little and Big Comfort. And I don't know that we've ever monitored that direct inflow. And it would only be right there by that culvert area where we could maybe test some of the water that's coming off of the Highway 8 ditching, just to see what's coming along with that. How much chloride is in there, how much other chemicals or nutrients are coming from that source, because that's constant.
Well, that's going to change though, Jackie. So you're just wasting money if we start on that right now, because within 2 years, that's all going to be redone. And
But
I
we need to know,
suspect
we need
better
to know what the
design will control that. So,
well, we need to know the baseline. I'm not talking about a long-term monitoring program, but if we can just get a baseline number for some of these things, I think that would be really helpful.
it's irrelevant. After you get it done, it's going to be irrelevant because it's changing without new highway design. So you'd want to look at the new highway design and figure out
Well,
what
it's
that's gonna be.
not irrelevant, because our rules are that you do not increase the outflow when there's development or a change on the landscape or change on the impervious level. So we need to know what it is now, so they can't increase it beyond what's already occurring. Hopefully improve it even.
Well, I'm sure Greg is working on that. If that's being occurred in our watershed, it's like any other land disturbance. I'm sure he's been working with the county and the state on that.
I'm giving my opinions here, Steve, so I'll let it be recorded and then see what happens with it, okay?
So I like my comments recorded also.
Anything else on the diagnostics report that we need to capture this evening?
Thought it was very well done, very thorough, and I think it's going to make a significant difference. So that's great. I
Do-
really like the 10-year plan too that you laid out for the putting it in a 10-year plan framework like that. It really helps provide some perspective on what we have to get done and when. So that's great. Good model for other areas, I think, too.
So do we have enough information in the report to accept it this evening, or do we need to see it come back?
I think we can
I think we
approve
have
it.
over 90, I think we have 95% of what we need. So I think we should just
Yeah.
approve it.
Okay.
Am I on mute? I'm not on
Nope,
mute.
you're good. Yep. we
Yeah,
got you.
no, I think that it's suitable to go forward, but I would like those areas addressed.
Okay. So Megan, you've heard the suggestions and the discussion so far, so yeah. All right, let's I guess a motion to accept the report is in order then.
I'll move that we accept the diagnostic report, subject to the suggestions and requests that were made.
I'll
Okay,
second.
motion's been made and seconded. Any other discussion? All right, I will call the roll. Manager Anderson,
Aye.
Major Schmaltz,
Aye.
Major Oknick,
Aye.
Major Spence, aye. All right, so we are already at 7 o'clock. We have one more topic, the Lake Association Cost Share Program, which is a discussion item for tonight. So can we try to hit this one real quick, introduce the topic to us, get us pointed in the right direction, and then come back to this at a future meeting?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. I'm not sure. Jackie, do you want to kick off
will.
this discussion? Okay, great.
I
Thank
will.
you.
Yeah, I think I first brought this up in January and just verbally brought it to the board, something I've been thinking about doing. The community grant program is what it's based on. And we've had very little activity from community nonprofits or other types of organizations. Maybe a couple of projects over the last, 15 years or so. And I was just thinking about one day about the good work that the lake associations have always done. Forest Lake is now back up and running and strong. And I thought this would be a good grant to broaden to lake associations. But because it's distinct from other community organizations and has a direct impact on our water bodies, I felt it needed to be its own titled grant, but based on that same outline of the community program. So if you look at the community grant in our current plan, you'll see that the language is almost identical. Obviously, I've changed it to be more appropriate for water and shoreline ownership. But other than that, it's got the same frame, it's got the same format. Now, when I brought it forward in January, I was working on a lake acre basis, if you'll remember, and Bone and Comfort are pretty close at 250 acres. And then the size differential with Forest Lake, it's so much bigger. I didn't think it was fair to have a grant program that was equal for different sizes of the lakes. So that's when I brought up that we could increase that one. That's something for the board to think about. I did not put it in this one, but I wanted to remind you of that conversation. Now, at the next meeting, I think it was March, where we talked about it, I was asked for some examples. And the only one that came to my mind that quickly was the AIS program that both the Bone Lake has been doing for 15 years and Comfort has been doing for just three I think, years now, or 4. And so we talked about that, and then it was suggested the staff, take a stab at this language and bring it back. Well, it came back as just an AIS program, and that's not what I intended at all. So what you see before you is the concept that I was thinking about from January on. So look it over. Again, we've got to do something, I think, to make it more even for our biggest lake. They're doing some pretty significant projects always, and you know, they've got 3 basins to worry about instead of 1. So I think we need to do something. And again, I think that if we, you know, tripled the grant size for Forest Lake, that makes sense to me. And that instead of 15,000, it would be 45,000 for Forest Lake. And I think by working in partnership with our lake associations, not only is it good public relations, you know, they're the most active people when it comes to lake health and helping us get the lakes back to where they belong and keeping them there. So the other thing is that, you know, we can't outreach to everyone, but we can outreach through our strong lake associations. And so the DNR program that I talked about a few years ago, Score Your Shore, it's already done, but to implement it in the field takes our people on the lakes that live on the lakes, the association, to encourage, this is a self assessment that people can do on their own. But it takes the associations, I think, to really, you know, bring that thing home and make people understand their part in stewardship. So there it is. It's right before you. It's pretty simple. So it's just, you know, coming to the concept like I did, and we can discuss it at the next meeting.
Okay.
Just
So,
one quick
yeah, go ahead, Steve.
suggestion. In the write-up on that, there's no page number on it, but it's Lake Association grant. You left out recreational value. So I think you want to probably include that, Jackie. You may want to go back and rewrite that sentence.
If you look at the paragraph, and I can add it there too, Steve, but if you look at the paragraph on the second page where those boxes are that say lake, you know, our partners, lake associations are our partners. But the very last sentence in that paragraph talks about that recreational value and how the lake associations are focused on different things than the watershed is, but they're still valuable for lake health. And those are the goals of the Clean Water Roadmap that the state put together after the Legacy Amendment was passed. And that focuses more on that very value, the recreational value of lakes, because that's what they determine people recognize. If the lake is fully swimmable, that means that you can swim in it throughout the whole season and you don't have these late algae blooms and so on. That the streams are healthy, and so the lake fish population is healthy. I know our lake association a couple of years ago did a stocking program with fish, working with the DNR. I don't know if Forest Lake has done that, but they probably have. So this is an expansive grant program. I don't want it limited to just one thing, because they're going to come up with ideas that we haven't thought about. And it's a way, like I said, to take some of the tax money that's coming from these populations and giving it back so that they can do good works. And I'm kind of excited about it, quite frankly. I think it's going to be really popular. But yeah, I'll do that. We can do that. Make your markups, and if you have any other suggestions you want to just send to me individually, give them to me, and I'll make the edits before the next meeting.
Okay, I'll send that to you, Jackie. That's
All right,
fine.
thanks, Steve.
Any other comments on this topic? We'll see it at a future meeting, so take a look at the materials, make some comments if you have them, and we'll see it come back, so.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Those are our topics for this evening's meeting, so a motion to adjourn is in order.
So moved.
I'll second.
Motion's been made and seconded. Any other discussion? I'll call the roll. Manager Anderson.
Aye.
Manager Smaltz.
Aye.
Manager Oknick.
Aye.
Manager Spence. Aye. We are adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks, Megan.
Good,
Yeah,
everyone.
night.
Welcome. Good night.